The village was a quiet pocket of dust and tradition, nestled between fields of mustard flowers and narrow lanes lined with crumbling stone houses. Everyone knew everyone. Secrets didn't stay secrets for long. But certain truths, the painful kind, were quietly buried under layers of custom and silence. It was a place where men spoke and women listened. Where fathers were law and daughters merely shadows of honor. But what happens when a shadow dares to step into the light? Stay tuned to Innocent Stories to find out. Zoya was 15, tall for her age, with restless eyes that always seemed to be searching for something beyond the village's borders. She had her father's smile, people used to say, soft, a little sad, but filled with warmth. He had passed away in a road accident when she was just 10. After that, everything changed. Her mother, Samina, was left to raise her alone in a society that saw widows as burdens and single mothers as helpless. Within a year, under pressure from relatives and community elders, Samina remarried. Sakhid entered their lives like a storm, wearing a mask. At first, he was polite, even generous, bringing sweets for Zoya and speaking gently to Samina. But once the wedding was over and the doors were closed, his voice grew sharper. He had a way of speaking that left no room for questions. Can one man's cruelty silence a girl's dreams forever? Keep watching Innocent Stories to see how Zoya fights back. Over time, his kindness vanished altogether, replaced by commands and cruel sarcasm. The villagers respected him. He was a landowner, had influence in the panchayat, and donated to the mosque regularly. No one dared speak against him. Zoya noticed the change in her mother first. Samina became quieter, her shoulders slumped as if weighed down by invisible chains. She stopped laughing, stopped looking Zoya in the eyes. Zoya, once a confident girl who ranked top in her class, began to feel a strange fear crawl under her skin. It wasn't one thing Sajid said. It was everything. How he looked at her like she was an inconvenience. How he locked her school books in the cupboard. How he told her she was growing up too fast and needed to stay in her limits. She tried to tell her mother once, quietly, during a night when Sajid wasn't home. But Samina had simply shaken her head, eyes filled with a panic she didn't explain, and whispered, "Just stay quiet. He gets angry." So Zoya stayed quiet, but silence is weight. And in that house, it pressed on her like a second skin. She would stare out the window during school holidays, watching other girls play outside while she scrubbed the floors or ran errands for Sajid. No one noticed the bruises, or if they did, they never asked. After all, she had food, a roof over her head, and a man in the house. What more could a girl want? Zoya didn't know it yet, but the quiet was only the beginning. Her bones would break before her voice would rise, but when it did, it would shake the earth beneath the very village that taught her silence. Sajid's transformation from a cold figure to a cruel one wasn't sudden. It was slow, calculated, like poison seeping into water. It began with little things. He would call Zoya in the middle of her studies to run errands. If she was late in responding, he'd raise his voice. Then came the questions: why do you need school anyway? What are you going to do with a degree? Find a husband through your books? Zoya tried to stay respectful. She wasn't confrontational by nature, but she wasn't submissive either. Her teachers praised her, saying she had the sharpest mind in the class. But Sajid didn't like sharp girls. He wanted silence, obedience, and eyes lowered to the ground. He began locking her books away, saying it was for her own good. When she objected, he slapped her, not hard enough to leave a bruise, but hard enough to remind her who was in control. The next day, he locked the main door from outside before leaving for work, trapping her inside the house. "You don't need school today," he said. "Or tomorrow." She screamed, pounded the door, begged her mother. But Samina just stood there, eyes wet, but lips sealed. "He's trying to protect you," she said weakly. "You're growing up. It's not safe out there." But the truth was written across her face: fear, deep, gut-twisting fear. She had tried to stand up to him once, months ago, when he shouted at Zoya for coming home late from class. He hadn't raised his hand that day, but the threat in his voice had silenced her completely. Since then, Samina had become a ghost in her own home, living just to survive. Verbal abuse became routine. Sajid would insult Zoya's intelligence, her appearance, her character. "You think just because you read a few books, you're something special," he spat one evening when she dared to ask for her textbooks. "Girls like you don't need education. You need discipline." He would tell Samina that Zoya was turning into a disgrace, that she needed to be fixed before she brought shame to the family. Samina would just lower her gaze, nodding silently. Then came the night everything changed. It was a Tuesday. Zoya had secretly borrowed a friend's textbook and hidden it in her dupatta. She sat in the kitchen after dinner, copying notes under the weak bulb. She didn't hear Sajid enter the room until his shadow covered the pages. He snatched the book from her hands and threw it across the room. "Still studying behind my back," he roared. She stood up, defiant for once, and shouted back, "You can't stop me forever." That was all it took. The next few seconds were a blur of rage and violence. He dragged her to the courtyard, cursed her, threw her down. She tried to run, but he caught her ankle and pulled her back. The neighbors might have heard the screams, but no one came. They never did. In villages like this, family matters stayed behind closed doors. She felt the first crack like lightning in her left leg. His boots slammed down with force again and again until her cries became gasps. Her right leg followed. The pain was beyond words, beyond screaming. She couldn't move. Her legs were twisted unnaturally. Samina ran out, sobbing, begging him to stop. He turned to her with wild eyes and said, "She needs to learn. Let this be the last time she talks back." By morning, the news had already spread, but in a different form. Zoya fell from the stairs, they said. A terrible accident. The village nurse came and shook her head gravely, but said nothing more. A few neighbors looked curious, even suspicious, but no one asked questions. Sajid stood by her hospital bed with a fake frown and told everyone how heartbroken he was. Zoya was admitted to the district hospital. Her legs fractured in multiple places. The doctor said it would take months to heal, maybe longer. But what shocked her more than the pain was the way no one seemed surprised. No police were called. No complaint was filed. Not a single adult asked her what had really happened. Even her teacher came once, brought flowers, and whispered gently, "Accidents happen, dear. Don't worry. You'll be fine." She felt like she had died and come back into a world that refused to see her. Broken bones were visible, but broken truths? They were buried under honor, respect, and the fear of what would happen if someone spoke too loud. Lying in that sterile hospital bed, Zoya realized something that would change everything. If no one was going to save her, she'd have to save herself. The hospital room was white, too white. The walls, the sheets, the light, it all blurred into one cold emptiness. Zoya lay motionless, her legs in casts, her body bruised and stiff. But inside, something was shifting. The pain hadn't dulled yet, but the shock had worn off, and with it came a clarity she'd never felt before. She stared at the ceiling for hours, sometimes days, not just thinking, but awakening. She had always been a girl who asked, why? Why are girls not allowed out after dark? Why must women always be quiet? Why did her mother's tears not matter? And now a deeper, heavier question, why had no one helped her? In those early days, when the nurses came in and out, checking IVs and adjusting pillows, most were distant, mechanical, but one of them wasn't. Nurse Aaliyah was in her late 30s with a soft voice and sharp eyes. She noticed things others didn't. How Zoya flinched when someone raised their voice. How she stared at the door whenever a man entered. One afternoon, when the ward was quiet, she sat beside Zoya's bed and gently asked, "Are you scared of going back?" Zoya didn't reply. But she didn't need to. Aaliyah nodded as if she already knew. She didn't press for answers, just offered presents and books. The next morning, she brought an old paperback and placed it by Zoya's side. "For the mind," she said with a small smile. "The body will heal, but the mind needs exercise, too." Zoya devoured the book like oxygen. It was the story of a young girl who stood up against injustice, fiction, but somehow truer than anything she'd read before. When she finished, Aaliyah brought her more biographies of women who'd fought and survived, tales of courage, quiet resistance, and justice. Each page stirred something fierce inside her. She began journaling. Aaliyah had brought her a notebook and pen. Zoya wrote everything: the pain, the anger, the betrayal. Her thoughts poured out in ink. How she wanted to scream in the face of every man who told her to be quiet. How she hated the silence of her mother. How she despised the way the village looked away. But beneath the anger, a seed of something new began to grow. Power, not the kind Sajid had, the kind built on fear, but the quiet, unshakable kind built on truth. She read about laws, rights, movements. She began to understand how power worked and how it could be challenged. One night, as she stared at her reflection in the glass window, pale face, eyes dark with rage and resolve, she whispered to herself, "This will not be the end of me." That moment was her turning point. She may have lost the ability to walk for now, but she had gained something far greater, the will to rise. She would not be a victim. Not anymore. She would return, not just to survive, but to make sure no girl in that village would ever suffer the way she did. Revenge was no longer just a fantasy. It was a plan in motion. The day Zoya returned home, the village air felt heavier than ever. Her legs, still weak and bound in braces, barely held her up. She leaned on her crutches, her mother supporting her on one side, Sajid walking ahead, his face a carefully curated mask of concern. Neighbors watched from their windows and doorways, some with pity, some with judgment, none with courage. The same whispers floated in the air: "Poor girl, fell down the stairs." But behind every hushed tone, Zoya could feel the weight of knowing eyes. They all suspected the truth. They just chose to ignore it. Zoya played her part well. She kept her eyes low, her voice soft. She nodded when Sajid spoke, limped when she had to walk, and never once mentioned school. She ate quietly, avoided unnecessary talk, and let them believe she had been broken not just in body, but in spirit. But inside, she was wide awake. Every day, she watched Sajid carefully. She had begun to understand him: how he walked when he drank, how he spoke when he was angry, how loud his voice got when he felt challenged. She noticed where he kept his phone, how he handled money, where he stored the spare keys. She noticed everything. And late at night, when the house fell into silence, and the fan spun overhead like a ticking clock, she began her real work. Hidden under her mattress was a small audio recorder, one that Aaliyah, the nurse, had smuggled to her just days before her discharge. "If he says anything threatening," she had whispered, "record it. Proof speaks louder than pain." The first few days, Sajid didn't say much, but slowly, as her silence lulled him into false confidence, he began to slip. His threats returned, not as violent as before, but still sharp. "Don't think your broken legs give you permission to dream," he'd hiss. "If I find out you've been talking about me to anyone, I'll make sure you can't ever leave this house again." Click. The recorder caught it all. Zoya needed help, real help, from someone who believed her. That's when she remembered Farhan. He was a journalism student she had met once during a school event. He was different, kind, curious, with a quiet fire in his eyes. She reached out through a friend, pretending she needed notes. They met in secret near the old school building. When he saw her braces and crutches, his face twisted in pain and anger. She told him everything. Farhan didn't hesitate. He listened, took notes, and swore to help. "I can't publish anything without solid proof," he said. "But if you can give me that, I'll make sure your voice is heard." Encouraged, Zoya doubled her efforts. Over the next few weeks, she recorded every insult, every threat, every twisted lecture Sajid delivered in the name of family honor. She even managed to photograph bruises he left on her mother's arms when he thought no one was looking. Her phone, now hidden deep inside a carved-out book, became her diary of truth. But revenge couldn't rely on evidence alone. She had to prepare herself for the storm she would bring. Through Farhan, she got access to articles, PDFs, and even a few ebooks on women's rights, protection laws, and helpline resources. At night, she read until her eyes burned. She memorized helpline numbers, understood the basics of filing a first information report, and learned about NGOs that specialized in women's safety and legal aid. She read case studies, women who had taken down monsters, not with fists, but with the power of law and public pressure. She trained her mind relentlessly. During the day, she practiced calm, how to speak without trembling, how to hide her intentions, how to stay 3 steps ahead. She even started subtle physical exercises her physiotherapist had suggested, regaining strength little by little. But that wasn't enough. She wanted to defend herself physically, too. Farhan arranged secret meetings with a local NGO worker, a woman named Syra, who taught self-defense to girls in slums. Zoya couldn't do high kicks or punches yet. But Syra taught her basics, how to break a grip, how to strike sensitive areas, how to use her crutch if she had to. Syra also taught her something more valuable, strategy. Never confront power head-on, she said. You make it trip over its own lies. You turn its strength into weakness, and you never, ever act before you're ready. Zoya listened, absorbed, grew stronger. By the time a month had passed since her return home, she was no longer the fragile, broken girl everyone thought she was. She was something new now, a survivor with a plan. Her body still healed, but her mind had turned into a fortress, and she had allies. Farhan had started dropping hints to his editor, who was skeptical at first. A village girl with broken legs, who'd believe her? But then came the voice recordings, the bruises, the timeline, the pattern. One day, Farhan texted her, "When you're ready, I can take this to the press." Zoya stared at the message for a long time, her hands trembling, not with fear, but with focus. She wasn't ready yet. Not fully. But the village that thought she had been silenced forever had no idea what was coming. She would not scream. She would rise. And when she did, she would bring the truth with her, sharp as fire, and louder than thunder. Zoya waited until everything was in place. The evidence, the contacts, her physical strength, each piece like part of a grand puzzle she had spent weeks assembling in silence. Sajid, still basking in the illusion of control, remained unaware of the storm building right under his roof. But the day finally came. Zoya sat in her room, closed the door quietly, opened her phone, and hit send. The audio files, clear, terrifying, and undeniable, were sent to Narish Shakti Trust, a women-led NGO based in the city. She had been in contact with them through Farhan, who had vouched for her story. At first, they had approached her case with caution. Many girls came forward, but few had solid proof. Once they heard Sajid's threatening voice, calling her a burden, warning he'd finish her if she ever spoke up, they moved quickly. The NGO lawyer sent a confirmation message the same evening, "We believe you. We're going to help." But Zoya wasn't done yet. With a second identity created under a fake name, she launched a social media account. She didn't post about herself first. Instead, she told the story of a nameless girl in a nameless village. A girl whose stepfather broke her legs for trying to study. Then she posted recordings, just short clips. Enough to stir curiosity. Enough to stir anger. The voice in the clip wasn't named, but people could tell it belonged to someone used to power, someone who had never been questioned. The response was quiet at first. A few likes, some comments, then women started messaging, "This happened to me too. My uncle used to say the same things. You were brave for sharing this." Zoya kept posting stories of abuse, of silence, of girls denied education and freedom. Each one paired with a simple black banner with white letters, #ZoyaKiwis. It took only 4 days for the hashtag to spread. First in nearby districts, then statewide. Influencers, activists, even celebrities began reposting. People wanted to know, who is Zoya? Where is this village? Who is this monster of a stepfather? And Zoya gave them answers, just not in the way anyone expected. Her next posts included blurred faces, altered voices, but real confessions. Girls from her own village, one she had spoken to in secret, came forward anonymously. One shared how a local shopkeeper had harassed her for months. Another, barely 14, spoke of a teacher who made her stay behind after class. All respected men, all untouchable until now. Zoya posted about them one by one, careful not to name names directly, but dropping enough clues. The village's walls of silence began to crack. People started whispering. The men who once walked with arrogance now moved with caution. Sajid noticed the change. He slammed his fists on the dinner table, asking Samina if she had been talking to anyone, eyeing Zoya suspiciously. But Zoya just looked down, weak and obedient as always, until he left the room and she opened her phone, her fingers already typing the next story. The tipping point came when the NGO released a public statement confirming they had received real evidence from a village survivor of gender-based violence. The statement didn't name Sajid, but said the perpetrator was a known figure, and they were preparing legal action. Then came the media. Farhan's article was published online, titled Voices from the Shadows, One Girl's Fight Against Silence. It included snippets of the recordings, quotes from villagers anonymously, and images of the bruises. It didn't just talk about Sajid. It talked about the culture that protected men like him. It asked the hard questions: why do people stay quiet? Why are women still afraid to speak in 2025? By the time the first news van arrived at the village entrance, Sajid was already losing sleep. Reporters began showing up with cameras, knocking on doors, asking about the girl with the broken legs. The villagers, many of whom had ignored Zoya for years, were suddenly cautious. Some blamed her. Others started to question their silence. Zoya watched it all unfold from behind her window, the sound of satellite news channels echoing through the narrow streets. Sajid raged, accusing Samina of leaking information, pacing the house like a caged animal. But there was nothing he could do. He couldn't stop the stories, couldn't stop the momentum, and most of all, he didn't know who to blame. Zoya had left no trail until now. She drafted her next post carefully, her fingers steady. My name is Zoya. I am not a victim. I am a witness, a fighter, a daughter of this village. You broke my legs, Sajid, but not my spirit. #ZoyaKiwis. She hit post. The village would never be the same again. The initial response from the village elders was swift and predictable: denial, disgust, dismissal. As news vans lined the narrow streets and reporters swarmed outside homes, the Saranch and his circle of gray-bearded advisors gathered in the community hall to issue a statement. These are lies, they said. Fabricated stories spread by outsiders who want to ruin the honor of our village. They called the videos edited, the audio fake, the accusations baseless. They painted Zoya as a misguided girl poisoned by modern thinking, influenced by city people. They summoned her mother, Samina, to the panchayat, demanding she speak on behalf of her husband. But Samina stood there, trembling, silent tears in her eyes. She didn't defend Sajid. And that silence said more than any words ever could. The elders, panicked by the rising attention, visited homes and warned families to keep their daughters indoors. Don't let them be part of this nonsense, they said. This will pass. But it didn't, because something had shifted. The women had seen the videos, heard the voices, and they had recognized not just Zoya's pain, but their own. Her story was their story, told out loud for the first time. One by one, quiet conversations began behind closed doors. Mothers speaking to daughters, sisters whispering to one another. And then, slowly, bravely, women started stepping out. A young girl named Rubina stood in front of her house and told a reporter how the village doctor had touched her inappropriately. Another, Shabana, shared how her own father beat her for wanting to finish school. These weren't just stories now. They were a movement. And at the center of it stood Zoya. She had been quiet for too long. Now she was ready to walk, not just in recovery, but in resistance. With support from the NGO, she organized a silent protest. A march led by girls and women dressed in white, holding placards with no slogans, just symbols of truth. Some carried broken slates. Others held school books. And Zoya, on her crutches, led them down the main street of the village. Her face uncovered, her eyes locked forward. People came out to watch. Some clapped softly, others wept. The march stopped at the gate of the panchayat office. Cameras were already rolling. Reporters had gathered. And in that silence, louder than any speech, Zoya stood firm, holding up a sign with just 3 words: "We are watching." Moments later, 2 police jeeps pulled in. Sajid was dragged from his house, shouting, spitting, his eyes wide with disbelief. He tried to declare innocence, threatened the officers, accused Zoya of ruining his life. But the police didn't flinch. They had orders. The arrest warrant was issued based on the recordings and the NGO's petition. Everything was documented. Everything was public. As he was shoved into the jeep, one reporter turned the camera towards Zoya. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. She simply raised her crutch in the air, high, steady, unbroken. And the village fell silent again, but this time with awe. The courtroom was packed. The air was heavy with tension. Reporters scribbling in notebooks, cameras flashing outside the building. Sajid sat in the defendant's chair, shackled, dressed in a plain white kurta, his usual arrogance now replaced with visible unease. He avoided eye contact with Zoya, who entered slowly, leaning on her crutches but walking without assistance. She wore a simple salwar kameez. No makeup, no dramatics, just calm, unshakable purpose in her eyes. When the judge asked if she had anything to say, Zoya stood. The room fell still. She spoke clearly, voice steady, each word a blade. She recounted the abuse, not just physical, but emotional. The control, the fear, the silence. She spoke not with bitterness, but with clarity, refusing to paint herself as a victim. Instead, she spoke for every girl who had ever been told to stay quiet. For every woman who had been shamed into silence. "I'm not here for revenge," she said. "I'm here for justice. Not just for myself, but for the girls who think pain is normal, that bruises are love, that fear is tradition. I am here to say we remember everything, and we will not be silent anymore." Gasps echoed across the room. Even the judge nodded solemnly before turning to the evidence. The recordings were played, the bruises documented, the testimonies from the NGO workers, journalists, and medical professionals were ironclad. Sajid's lawyer tried to shift the blame, tried to call her unstable, attention-seeking, but it all fell apart under the weight of undeniable proof. The sentence came swiftly. Sajid was found guilty on multiple counts: domestic abuse, attempted grievous harm, and intimidation. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. As he was escorted away, reporters flooded out of the courtroom with breaking headlines. But the case didn't stop with Sajid. Zoya had already submitted anonymous testimonies and recordings involving other men in the village. One by one, their names were called to the court. Some fled, some denied. But the wheels of justice had started turning. Investigations were opened. Suspended officials interrogated teachers, nervous community leaders. It was the beginning of something long overdue. Zoya's story exploded across national media. Headlines read, "Broken Bones, Unbroken Spirit, #ZoyaKiwis, a village girl who brought down monsters from silence to strength. The girl who changed everything." Her face was everywhere, not glamorized, but strong, raw, real. Interviews poured in, but she chose carefully, giving voice to those who couldn't speak for themselves. Back in the village, something extraordinary began to bloom. Inspired by her courage, women formed education circles in their courtyards. Older women who never went to school began learning to read. Mothers encouraged their daughters to go back to class. Girls once hidden behind veils now stood in line outside community halls, registering for self-defense workshops and awareness sessions. The same lanes that once carried whispers of shame now echoed with purpose and pride. Zoya didn't just win a case. She sparked a movement. The village, once bound in silence, had begun to find its voice. Months passed, but the echo of Zoya's voice in the courtroom never faded. It rang in the hearts of people far beyond the village, across towns, cities, even abroad. She received letters, emails, and phone calls from people she had never met: students, survivors, activists, even government officials. But among all the messages, one stood out. A letter from a prestigious law university offering her a full scholarship. They had read her story, watched her interviews, and believed she had the potential to turn her fire into lasting change. Zoya stared at the acceptance letter for a long time, tears in her eyes, crutch still leaning against the wall beside her. She had dreamed of learning the law not just to defend herself, but to protect others like her, those who never had the chance. Now, it wasn't just a dream. It was real. The night she packed her bag for the city, her mother, Samina, sat beside her. They hadn't spoken much about the past, but there was a quiet understanding between them now. The fear that once ruled Samina's life had begun to fade. Watching her daughter rise from pain had planted a seed of courage in her too. One morning, without drama or announcement, Samina walked out of Sajid's old house for good. She rented a room near the local school and started helping young girls with their homework. "I should have protected you," she whispered once, eyes filled with guilt. Zoya took her hand. "You're protecting me now." A year later, the village was no longer the place it had once been. The shame had shifted from the survivors to the abusers. A new school building stood on the edge of the village, painted in soft blues and whites, with an open courtyard and wide windows that let sunlight flood every room. Above the main entrance, written in bold letters, was the name, Zoya Foundation for Justice. The inauguration was small but powerful. Children laughed in the playground. Women served tea and snacks. Journalists stood back respectfully. Zoya arrived in a simple white kurta, her hair tied back, a red folder in her hand. She didn't need the crutches anymore. She stood tall. Every step a statement of survival. As she stepped up to the mic, the crowd grew still. "I was told once that my dreams were dangerous," she began, her voice clear, calm, and strong. "That education wasn't for girls like me. That silence was safety. That obedience was honor. But I learned something else, something far more powerful. That our voices are stronger than fear. That justice is not a gift, but a fight. And that no matter how broken the world tries to make you feel, you can always rise." She paused, looking at the children in the front row, bright-eyed, unafraid. "He broke my legs," she said finally, her voice ringing through the courtyard. "But I found my wings." The crowd erupted in applause, and somewhere deep in that village soil, a new future began to grow. Don't miss more inspiring stories like Zoya's. Subscribe to Innocent Stories for tales of courage, resilience, and hope.